Well, hello everyone. Good evening to you all. My apologies at the very beginning here. Hopefully you all can hear me. I can't see the chat tonight. So there's something that's come up on my screen here, which is not allowing me to look in and see those things. But I know that we have people on and do appreciate everybody coming in tonight and being a part of our live stream. We have I've decided to make sure we cover through to the end of chapter 11. I didn't want to jump into chapter 12 without having covered that off. And last week I sort of got stuck in one portion of it. So hopefully I can move a little bit quicker through tonight. And by half past, I can have us at least near the end of this chapter. But at any rate, this is our third lesson in the series of the final vision which Daniel saw, and it's a great sweeping vision of things of the end, and looking, of course, at those kingdoms that Daniel was talking about throughout the chapters of this book. We think back to the visions of chapter 2 with with that image which Nebuchadnezzar saw and Daniel's interpretation of that, or rather the interpretation that God gave him. And then going on to chapter 7, the visions that he saw there and the interpretations of those visions, and into chapter 8 and chapter 9. Of course, it goes on and on. And many times, as I've mentioned to you, these visions are coming back again and covering the same material, sometimes giving more information in certain areas and covering them off again. We see that again and again in the book of Daniel. And so we're looking at this last segment of chapter 11 tonight, and primarily looking at verses 30 on through the end. I believe last week we took as our concluding point verse 29. But just to remind everyone of where we were, we'll just back up a little bit. In verse 28, still talking there about Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus the Fourth. Remember, his father was Antiochus the Third. It's very, very unique, isn't it? But he called himself the Great, Antiochus the Great. His son took upon himself the name Epiphanes, which relates to him thinking himself to be God manifest. In his case, he thought he was Zeus made flesh. And that comes back into the story in just a little while. And hopefully tonight we'll be able to see how history folds back on itself. Or probably better said, history seems to repeat itself. So let's look at the first part of this historical view as we're looking at the end of the Grecian Empire, that he-goat that passed through and had the great horn, which was Alexander the Great, and that horn being broken, 4 came up in its place. And those 4 kings, which were prominent members of the cabinet of Alexander the Great. We looked at a couple, the Ptolemaic Empire, mainly Egypt, but also at points in time took over the land of what is known as Israel today, all the way through, in some cases, into Syria. And then there was the empire of the Seleucids, which was literally the old Persian Empire going forward into Babylon, and at different times coming into the land of Israel, and even at times going into Egypt and controlling them. We looked at that at the end of our last discussion in verse 27. Verse 28 talks about the time when Antiochus Epiphanes went in and really subdued the nation of Israel to it, or the nation of Egypt to himself. And it says in verse 28, he shall return into his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. That is the sort of, I wouldn't call it a peace agreement that his father Antiochus the Great. It wasn't so much a peace agreement as it was an agreement that Antiochus the Great had made with the people of Israel, that they would be allowed to sort of maintain their religious beliefs. They in turn had helped Antiochus the third in taking control of Egypt, and so there was sort of an uneasy peace. And in verse 28 tells us about the great riches which he amassed out of Egypt. But of course, Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, when he came back through, he also raided the temple of God in Jerusalem. He also raided other temples too. He was a man whose heart was given to wealth and to riches, and so he engaged himself in that pursuit. And so it says in verse 29, at the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter. And this is where we wound up last week's discussion in covering that ground. And I mentioned some of these things that had happened. Of course, when Antiochus Epiphanes went to Egypt, he decided to go in again and just to confirm Egypt and the Ptolemies as being his subjects. He had placed a king over them and thought that he would go back in and just make sure that everything was established. And he thought he could, as he had done before, win one of the Ptolemies, one brother or the other, over to his side, and he would leave that person in charge, take more wealth, obviously, and then return. But you recall, this was the time that he was met by representatives from Rome. This was the time before the Caesars ruled Rome. This was the time of the Roman Senate and the Republic of Rome. And the Republic had been petitioned by Egypt, by the Ptolemies, that they needed help, that Antiochus was coming to destroy them. And of course, this was a perfect opportunity for Rome to expand its reach without really having to do much. So they promised the Ptolemies that they would be their backers, they would be their might and their strength, right? And so that they could stand against Antiochus should he come again. And obviously he was on his way. Hearing this, the Roman Senate got together and quickly formulated a text and sent it through. And I read this before. I think it's worth reading it again. I know it might be that you all would get a bit bored with this, but it's really important for the history of the nation of Israel, the history of that region, that we understand this, because up until this time, Greece has been in charge of the land of Israel, and Israel has been Hellenized, or they have been sort of changed over, or have this Greek background now put in their place. They've been ruled by people who identify with Greece, obviously. But now we have this instance. So the Ptolemies sent to Rome, as I mentioned, for assistance, and the ships of Chittim is referred to in verse 30. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him, talking here again about Antiochus Epiphanes, and he shall be grieved in return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do, and he shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. And arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. Talking about when Antiochus raised an altar to Zeus in the temple of God and offered pigs in sacrifice to Zeus, which was Antiochus's god, God with a small g, but nevertheless, he desecrated the temple. He set up the abomination that maketh desolate in the temple. And the Bible goes on to say in verse 32, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. So we all know what happened to Antiochus Epiphanes. I mentioned that last week. So you remember when Popilius was sent with ships to greet Antiochus and to find out what his intentions were, and to let them know that the Ptolemies had appealed to the Senate for their backing and their firepower, and that they had granted that wish. So Popilius, with whom Antiochus had an understanding with before he knew him from his time when he was in Rome, Antiochus offered Popilius his hand, sort of to say, "Here, I am a king, kiss my hand." And Popilius obviously did not do that, and he had told him what the Senate had said, that the Senate wanted to know his purposes for coming into Egypt, and to let him know that the Senate had agreed to back those Ptolemies in Egypt, the Ptolemies who were the kings of Egypt. And of course, this had thwarted the plans. The plan was to go in, set up your king to be loyal to you, and to take some more of the riches of Egypt and to go. And this was thwarted because Antiochus Epiphanes said, "Well, I'm going to have to discuss what I'm going to do with my people. I'll have to discuss what our decision is," because Popilius had said, we're backing them, and if you do something against the Ptolemies, then Rome is going to come against you. So when Antiochus said these things, that's when Popilius, remember I said he had a rod in his hand, and he drew a line in the sand around Antiochus Epiphanes, and he said, "You'll make your decision before you leave this circle." And he said, "So talk to your people right now and decide what you're going to do. If you leave this circle, then you will be at odds with Rome, and Rome is going to come and defend the Ptolemies." And of course, he was dejected. He was angry. He was everything you can imagine. And so, being somewhat wise in the things of war, he said, we will agree to leave. We will leave and not upset the apple cart, not go to war with Rome, but we'll leave in peace. And he left, but not in peace. Of course, we know that he went into Judea, he went into Jerusalem, and all of the things that we've just read from this passage of scripture through to those few verses. He came against the people of God. He looted the temple. He offered that abomination that made the temple desolate, and it remained desolate for about 3 years, maybe a little bit less than that. It says, and in verse 33 is interesting, "And the covenant shall he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they shall understand among the people, they that understand among the people shall instruct many, yet they shall fall by the sword and by flame, and by captivity and by spoil many days." And of course, there was a great destruction. Many people were killed. And Antiochus went on his way eventually. And of Of course, he heard of the tidings of troubles in the east of his country. This was back in the area where he held powerful sway, back in that area of the Persian Empire, the old Medes and Persian Empire. There was rumblings back there. And of course, we know that he went that way and was won a couple of victories over there, but eventually that he died. And he died in that most horrific way that he actually rotted from the inside out. And I've mentioned to you how this seems to be a real thing that happens to rulers because it happens again in history. But nevertheless, Antiochus Epiphanes eventually died. And of course, this was the beginning of the end, wasn't it? The beginning of the end of the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great, his 4 generals, and their descendants. Because the country to the north, which was Asia Minor, which was overseen by one of those generals, had long since been lost. In fact, the father of Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus III, Antiochus the Great, went up to try to win a victory, thought he would go up against the kings there, but obviously Rome was supporting them as well. It's interesting because the battle was fought in Lydia, and Lydia is modern day Turkey. And I have a little blurb about this that I'd like to read to you. This was called the Battle of Magnesia. That was the name of the location of the battle. And it says here, the Battle of Magnesia took place in December 190, January 189 BC. It was fought as part of the Roman Seleucid War, putting forces of the Roman Republic, led by Consul Lucius Cornelius Scipio Asiaticus, say that 3 times fast, and allied with the kingdom of Pergamon, Eumenes II, against the Seleucid army of Antiochus III, or Antiochus the Great, father of Epiphanes. The 2 armies initially camped northeast of Magnesia in Asia Minor, attempting to provoke each other into a battle on favorable terrain for several days. When the battle finally began, Eumenes managed to throw the Seleucid left flank into disarray, while Antiochus's cavalry overpowered his adversaries on the right flank of the battlefield. His army's center collapsed before he could reinforce it. Modern estimates give 10,000 dead for the Seleucids and 5,000 killed for the Romans. The battle resulted in a decisive Roman Pergamon victory, which led to the Treaty of Apamea that ended Seleucid domination in Asia Minor. So you see, Antiochus's father had already lost Asia Minor. So that had reduced the size of his kingdom. It was now the kingdom virtually of Rome. And now Antiochus has lost Egypt, or the Ptolemaic kingdom. He's had to walk away in disgrace when Popilius drew the circle in the sand. So now his kingdom has shrunken. Now it's only that land of what was Israel, going back through Babylon to Medo-Persia, and now there's troubles back in the east. So all of the destruction happens that we mentioned in Jerusalem. The temple is defiled, and Antiochus Epiphanes goes back east to try to quell this rebellion that's going on and try to hold on to some of his kingdom. But what happens? Well, he dies. He dies coming back. He never makes it back into the land of Israel. And his son, whom he wanted to rule in his stead, is just a young boy. And from that time, that kingdom, the kingdom that was the once ruled by Antiochus Epiphanes, is now divided into two segments. And so it was the beginning of the end. The end was not quite yet, but it was coming apace. It wouldn't be long until the Romans, who controlled the south and the north, would take control of that land. In fact, it would happen not in the not too distant future. So old Antiochus Epiphanes, let's remember it one more time how he died. And so it says, the ungodly man's body swarmed with worms. And while he was still living in anguish and pain, his flesh rotted away. And because of the stench, the whole army felt revulsion at his decay. So the man died from the inside out, I suppose, as men do. But nevertheless, that was the end of the Seleucid powerhouse over that land. And it wouldn't be long, 63 BC, Pompey the Great would come and would annex the land of Israel, would take control of it. And of course, we know that what happened following that. Around 37 BC, Herod would capture Jerusalem, and he would execute Antigonus II, and he would marry the Hasmonean princess Mariamne I, and would set up his kingdom. King Herod would be upon the throne. And those of us who know the Bible are familiar with King Herod, familiar for him for his great work with the temple. He rebuilt that temple. He increased the area of the Temple Mount. He beautified the temple, spent many, many years and much, much money increasing the temple itself. And of course, we know that around this time also, the Caesars, of course, began to reign in Rome, and they exercised their dominion. Herod, although he was a king, was a vassal to Rome. He was under the control of Rome. And so he secured his kingdom, I suppose Herod did. He beautified the temple to make sure that his kingdom was secure. He was almost like a false Messiah, wasn't he? Coming in and rebuilding the temple of the Jews, pouring money into it. And you can see how people would look upon him as a Messiah, as someone restoring the temple of God. But he was anything but that. 5 BC, of course, we have the decree of Caesar Augustus, right? That all the world should be taxed, that a census should be taken, and that everyone's homeland would determine what the taxes would be, because taxes were exacted from these vassal nations every single year. Their taxation was made. And of course, we know the birth of Jesus Christ happened during that time of the taxation. Mary was great with child when she was riding that donkey and went into Bethlehem, the place where Jesus was to be born. There was no room for them. You recall she gave birth in a stable, and all of the things that happened after that. So you see how the end of these things is coming to a rapid end. It's like the sands of an hourglass. It must have looked so far away for Daniel in his visions. In fact, when we get into chapter 12, Daniel's going to say, I just don't understand it. And the Lord is going to tell him, seal up the book, for you're going to stand in latter days upon the earth. We're going to have a look at that perhaps next week. We'll try to get into it if we can. So the chapter 11 now, I wanted to mention this. I mentioned that history folds back on itself, didn't I? So you see what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes. He goes into the land of Egypt. He's turned away. He goes back through into Israel, into Jerusalem, and he desecrates the temple, right? He robs it. He moves on. This very same thing would happen again. Um, Titus and his father were encamped against Jerusalem. The same thing happened in the time of Antiochus. The nation of Israel was divided. There were people that were had loyalties to every other thing. There were many who had turned away from the God of heaven and had began to worship, the gods of the Greeks. And there were a group, of course, who were stalwarts who continued on in the ways that they had been taught, but they were very few and far between. There were many groups and sects in Israel in the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, and you recall it said there that he aligned himself with some to overthrow and to win that great victory. Well, the very same thing happens in 70 AD when Titus and his father, they go into Egypt. Titus's father moves on and goes up to become the Caesar over Rome. He does so in 69 into 70 to 79 AD. He becomes the Caesar. Well, he sends his son Titus back to quell that rebellion in Judea. And so, just like there was a rebellion in the days of Antiochus Epiphanes, someone in the city of Jerusalem started the rumor that said Antiochus had died. Well, Antiochus wasn't dead. He came in and did his great desecration of the temple, set up that abomination that maketh desolate. Well, the same thing happens again. The nation of Israel is divided, and they're in sects and in groups. There are some that are loyal to Rome, some that are still loyal to the old dynasties of the Seleucids and the Hasmoneans that ruled in that area. And they were all, it was just a jumbled mess. They were fighting amongst themselves already. That was the rebellion. The rebellion wasn't really so much against Rome as it was a rebellion amongst themselves. But Titus's father said, go back and quell that rebellion. And boy, Titus did that. He may not have set out with the intentions of destroying Jerusalem, but that infighting of the people of Jerusalem in that day ended up bringing about the destruction not only of the temple in 70 AD, but the destruction and burning of Jerusalem itself. It was left desolate. And even to this day, it is desolate. But in came the Roman kingdom, which Nebuchadnezzar had seen as the legs of iron, legs and feet of iron, and the toes, remember, iron mingled with clay. And so that the nation of Rome had altered itself many times, from the Republic to the time of the Caesars, on to the Holy Roman Empire, and to what it is now, which is just the papacy. That's the vestiges of the Roman Empire. It is the toes of iron mingled with clay. These are the days in which we live. And When I say history folds back on itself, there are many people who look at verses 36 through 45 and say this refers uh, to a future king. And certainly we know that there is a time of great trouble to come. And there is still much said in the book of Revelation about judgments coming to this earth. And perhaps in our next lesson, we'll be able to get into some of those, because in the next lesson, in chapter 12, verse 1, Michael stands up. And when Michael stands up, we see a great resurrection happen. And we'll be looking at that next week. There's so much to cover still. I doubt that we're going to finish next week, but we should be very close. So I appreciate your attention tonight and sticking with me, even though I know we cover so many of the same things over and over again. But these things are there for us to remember and to see that history is repeating itself over and over again. It really is. From Antiochus Epiphanes through to Titus, through to that last great Antichrist, which will come and will promote himself to be above all. History just continues to repeat itself until time shall be no longer, until the Lord reigns and rules over this earth, and he puts down all authorities and all powers, and he rules this earth with a rod of iron. And then, of course, we have much to look forward to even after that. Because when this world is rolled up like a scroll, when the heavens and the earth are brought together like a scroll, then he speaks and creates a new heaven and a new earth. He says, wherein dwelleth righteousness, the eternal home of the saved, the eternal home of his people. Well, as I said, much to look forward to. We're going to have a guest speaker this coming Sunday, so we invite you to come and be with us at 10 a.m. This Sunday at Morayfield East State School. That's where Bethesda Baptist Church meets. And we'll be having missionary Bob McGee preaching for us on Sunday morning. And so we're all looking forward to that and hope to see you there. We will have services again Sunday night. We're going through and looking at the tabernacle, and we're looking this week at the courtyard and the gate of that courtyard. And we're looking and finding Jesus in that tabernacle. We certainly will this week. So I look forward to seeing you then. We'll see you right back here again next Thursday, 7 p.m. for our Thursday Night Live. We'll be in chapter 12 of the book of Daniel. Until that time, God bless you and keep you, and we'll see you then. All right. Good night, everybody.